What do you
And
think?
we saw with COVID that the impetus or like people's propensity was really to initially blame migrants and immigrants. And now we're circling back to that narrative again. And it's like, we know COVID affects everybody. Like, you're not getting COVID from an immigrant more so than you're getting from your neighbor, your child, your family member. Like, it's interesting that the reaction to COVID initially was to, close borders, and they used public health guidance to justify basically closing borders. And for example, Trump era policy that was put in place that asylum seekers couldn't seek asylum at the US southern border has been held up by the Biden administration. It's Title 42. It's really not founded on any sound public health guidance at all. It's just a decision that
any problems.
It's just a decision that, oh, migrants are vectors for disease. And that's how people want to think about immigrants and migrant communities. And that's like a huge global, it's a problem everywhere.
Well, I mean, if we're going to do that, we should build a wall around Florida.
Well, let me ask you this though. I mean, to play devil's advocate a little bit, when you look at a lot of the migrants who move from place to place, like let's say whether it's in Syrian migrants or migrants from Latin American countries trying to come to the US, typically, and this is something we've seen also here in the US, not just amongst like migrants or recent migrants, but vaccination efforts or rates, let's say, are typically or have been typically lower in let's say Latin and Hispanic communities, right? And so part of the I think the argument is that, well, some of these people or a lot of these people may come and not be vaccinated or not want to be vaccinated, or I don't know what the extent of the reasons or factors are, but what would you, if you had a magic wand and you could deal with this situation, right? How would you approach this from a public health standpoint?
I think we need to do a lot better, and there is a movement towards this about community-based vaccination campaigns. I would disagree with the premise that any ethnic or racial community is to blame for their low vaccination rates. I would say that people doing the vaccinations are to blame for not reaching out and educating and going into those communities and really talking about vaccination. We have really good examples of when, just having like a street fair where you like one-on-one talk to people about the benefits of vaccine, how vaccine uptake increases from that personal interaction. And there is efforts from the Biden administration currently to engage in those community-based efforts to increase uptake. There's also millions of doses of Pfizer and Moderna that are going to expire at the southern border by the end of this month. And we could easily have a policy that opens up access to those vaccinations for some of the migrant communities at the border or peering at the border. We've done a pretty terrible job, I would say, as a country, helping vaccines get distributed around the world. And quite frankly, this disease will not end until global vaccination rates are higher. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, you need to have access to vaccines, and you need to make the choice to get vaccinated in order to actually see an end to this pandemic. And so it's really sad to me when you see millions of doses of a vaccine go to waste at a border, and that option is not given to communities just because they're migrants or seeking asylum or whatnot.
I think it was on the Young Turks the other day, was they were saying how the rest of the world must view the US and Americans as monsters because we hoard all these vaccines and we don't use them. There's so many people who don't want to get vaccinated, and yet we refuse to, send these vaccinations out so that someone can benefit from them. So it's terrible, as you put it.
I mean, the fact that something like a vaccine becomes an object of ideology is the problem. Like, that is the major problem in terms of vaccination, is that you make it an ideological point, and it's not. And you know, fuck all you guys. Like, you've been vaccinated. Like, do you have polio?
Yeah.
Have you been you've been vaccinated for polio and tuberculosis? You were vaccinated before you were even, you know, conscious as a decision making person. And vaccinations work. We know they work. It's something we've been doing for a century or more than a century. So, you know, the idea that you make it a point of ideology and make it questionable, it's like, well, what about all the other vaccinations that you've had?
Also, the point of like making it available to a select few and not others because they're migrants or they're not because of racism. Like we saw in the, you know, Israel is often elevated for its high vaccination rates, but
Yeah,
there's
except for the territories.
except for the Palestinians. So
Yeah.
there's a whole discussion that could be had there. And it's like, you not giving your neighbor access to vaccinations is ultimately not going to help with your COVID rates because you're only doing as well as your neighbor is doing. So
I think that's been a common theme with this whole COVID situation, just in general, not just with vaccines, but just with everything else. It's like, you know, we can't keep living the way we have been, where we just focus on our individual selves and our own individual well-being as people, as communities, as a country. You know, it's just yeah, that keeps coming up. And now they're talking about the booster shot, and that they want to get that, you know, rolled out. And the WHO was telling rich countries to hold off on that before they could send out, you know, vaccines to poorer countries so that more people could get vaccinated first. So it's for how much longer can this keep going? It's interesting. And yeah, Israel, you brought up Israel, they're at the forefront of that booster shot. It's like, well, your neighbors haven't even been vaccinated fully yet, and you're already trying to roll out the booster shot for your people.
No, not only did the Palestinians not get vaccinated, but the Israeli occupation force in the West Bank actually blocked and shut down vaccination spots.
And they destroyed the one
people,
vaccination center in, what was it, the one COVID center in Gaza.
Yeah.
And Israelis who were in settlements, in illegal settlements, were offered vaccinations when Palestinians weren't. So there's many different dimensions of that issue that I think often don't get elevated. And there's quite a few really important advocates, I think, doing work in that space as well.
But how do you, go ahead.
Well, I think there are some issues that should be recognized as transcending borders and boundaries and politics and global pandemic, and battling that is something that everyone needs to put down their sword and shield and get rid of their ideology to deal with this, and then we can get back to fighting if you want.
Right. Well, I agree, but I also think it's like, I think framing it as racism is really helpful sometimes, because some of these issues, like issues at the southern border, the Palestinian and Israel issue with vaccinations, like there's an element of racism, and not to go back to like anti-Muslim racism or anti-Arab racism, but I do think it's a big component of what we see. Yeah,
of course. And there's it's sort of soft ethnic cleansing.
Yeah,
like we'll let you know, you will let you languish and we'll let you die of these diseases.
Well,
It,
how
I mean,
do
go
go
ahead.
ahead, go ahead.
No, you go for it.